Israel stands before the world as a pariah state. If there were any skerricks of illusion that Israel was a bastion of civilization and democracy, they lie buried in the rubble of mosques and churches, of schools, of hospitals, of homes, along with the bodies of countless Palestinian people. Israel has revealed itself in the eyes of millions of people. The political axis of the world has shifted sharply. Millions of people have gone from indifference to the question of the Palestinian question, or have moved from passive to active support to Palestine. This is a generational shift which creates a series of radical challenges for the system and radical challenges for us who want to fight the system. To put the killings in Gaza in context, according to the United Nations, between 2008 and September 2023, Israel killed 6,407 Palestinians. Now, each of those deaths was a tragedy and a crime, but that took 15 years. Now, in 6 months, they have increased that death rate 5 times over, and we don't know actually, in reality, how many people have died. The result has been a significant shift in global opinion against Israel, and we know this empirically, not just through our gut feelings. Support for Israel dropped globally between September and December by 18.5%. There's also been an enormous cost for Israel's ally-in-chief, the United States. In Egypt, in the same sort of period, support for the United States fell, and this is not a misprint, 56%. In Saudi Arabia, support for the United States fell 23%. 96% of Saudis believe that all the Arab states should break their ties with Israel. And that's a reflection of the understanding that while there have been words of solidarity from the Arab rulers, they have continued to want to do business with Israel. But one victim of the events of the last 6 months is that the possibility of a peace deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia, a normalization deal, part of the Abraham Accords, now lies in tatters. The Saudi people would never allow their government to sign an agreement with Israel. In the United States, Joe Biden is paying a substantial price for his support for Israel. The share of adults under 30, and it's young people who always show the way on these issues, who feel that Biden is biased towards Israel, has risen from 27% to 36%. Over in Britain, 52% of young people think Israel's war is unjustified. We're seeing the chipping away of the understory of the Israeli project in the eyes of the world. And even The Economist, which is the house magazine of global capitalism, said that Israel could be winning the battle in Gaza but losing the war. It argued that for decades, Israel's security doctrine has rested on 3 pillars: deterrence, early warning, and decisive victory. And all 3 of those pillars have now crumbled. And I think we can add to The Economist's reading of the situation, the global legitimacy of Israel is crumbling as well. I think importantly but remarkably, that shift is happening also amongst Jews worldwide. After all, the Zionist project is a project which says it will establish a Jewish homeland for those fleeing from anti-Semitism, a safe haven where Jewish people can build a normal society. And substantial numbers of Jewish people, particularly young Jewish people, are calling bullshit on that argument. And it was happening before the horrors in Gaza. In 2021, a poll showed that 34% of American Jews agreed that Israel's treatment of Palestinians is similar to racism in the United States. 25% agreed that Israel is an apartheid state, and 22% agreed that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians. In 2021, I would like to see those questions repeated in 2024. Amongst younger Jews, the shift has been much more dramatic. 20% said they agreed with the statement that Israel doesn't have a right to exist. This is younger Jews in America, remember. A third agreed that Israel is committing genocide, and more than a third agreed that Israel is an apartheid state. Now, some of you might be saying, well, those figures are not quite as dramatic as David is making out. 20% here, 30% here. It's not decisive. Well, I can tell you, I have been an anti-Zionist Jew for 47 years, and these figures are unprecedented. Absolutely unprecedented. In fact, I think we can argue that the level of Jewish opposition to the Zionist project is running at the highest level since before the Holocaust. Israel is in danger of losing an entire generation of young Jews. It is in danger of losing the legitimacy amongst a significant proportion of the Jewish community. Above all in the United States, but the United States matters, not only because the United States is a key imperialist power, but because the Jewish community is so big there. And we can see echoes of that around us here in Sydney and in Melbourne. The activities of the Tzedek Collective in Sydney, the Loud Jew Collective in Melbourne. As far as I'm aware, neither of those collectives existed more than a year ago. And when I was younger, you had to be a revolutionary socialist to be a Jewish opponent of Zionism. Today, many people with a much broader range, shall we say a softer range of general politics, are coming in behind the argument, not in my name. And so we have a situation where Israel is losing the support of the world population. It is losing the support of a substantial proportion of the Jewish community, many of whom have come out on amazing rallies, again, particularly in the United States. Hundreds and thousands of Jews blockading central stations, protesting in front of the White House. So this is a shift of world historic significance in terms of the fight against imperialism. But I'm afraid we can't leave it there, because if I stood here to tell you that Zionism is in its death throes, that its process of weakening will lead to its collapse, I'm afraid I don't think that would be true. I think we have a much more complicated story to tell. I'll come back to that point in a minute. The other thing which I think has not so much unfolded in the last 6 months, but a process which has consolidated and become much more visible in the last 6 months, is the difference between the response of the left and the right towards Israel. I think many of you would be flabbergasted if I told you that the primary supporters of Israel, even 40, even 30 years ago, were those on the left, those around the Communist Party, the Labour left, and even sections of the revolutionary left. Here's a little pamphlet. It's the best 5 pence I think I ever spent. I bought it in about 1977 in Britain, produced by our comrades in the Socialist Workers' Party. Israel a racist state? ? Now, I think we could be confident if we produced a pamphlet today, there would be no question mark. But it was a sign of the times. And this is what the introduction to the pamphlet said, an indication of the legitimacy of Israel which we're seeing stripped away. Many people find it difficult to understand why any socialist can oppose the state of Israel. For them, Israel is an outstanding example of a people that has suffered the most terrible oppression and is now fighting back. Compared to the rest of the Middle East, dominated as it is by feudal monarchies and military dictatorships, Israel seems a haven of democracy and socialism. Now, rest assured, the comrades then went on in the rest of this little pamphlet to destroy those ideas with a series of arguments which still echo down the decades for us. But in 1977, the starting point was that the left supported Israel. That is no longer the case. With some small, disgraceful pockets, by and large, the left has come in wholeheartedly behind the Palestinian people. Now, Israel's support rests primarily on the political right. You think of who has come out in the last 6 months. I'll come back to Biden, but who has come out in the last 6 months most clearly for Israel. And the names of Viktor Orban, Javier Milei, and Narendra Modi stand out. Viktor Orban is the Prime Minister of Hungary. He is an anti-Semite through and through. He is a primary purveyor of the anti-Semitic conspiracy that the financier George Soros is a puppet master pulling the strings of progressive movements all around the world. He's a friend of Israel. Israel is a friend of Orban. Javier Milei is the newly elected president of Argentina. He is a misogynist, a homophobe, a transphobe, and elected on a platform of destroying working class living standards and slashing jobs. He loves Israel. He loves the process it is undertaking in Gaza. And Narendra Modi is the Prime Minister of India, coming up for re-election very, very, very soon. Narendra Modi leads a political movement which is in parallel with Zionism, where Zionism says the Palestinians are inferior, they cannot have full rights, and they have to be expelled if necessary, and they bind that together with Islamophobia and anti-Arabism. Narendra Modi is in the process of turning India into an ethno-nationalist state where only Hindus have full rights, where Muslims are second-class citizens, where Muslims face the prospect of pogroms, and Narendra Modi, who is establishing an Israeli-adjacent regime inside India, loves Israel. And did you know that Adani, there are two major big corporations in India, Adani and Tata. Adani owns a port on the Israeli coast. The links between Israel and India are greater and greater. So here are people. Narendra Modi is directly responsible for anti-Muslim pogroms in India. And he loves Israel, and Israel loves him. And so does Anthony Albanese, by the way. And so we now get to a situation where, far from Israel being a bastion of left-wing values supported by the left, it is now clearly a land of right-wing values supported by the right. In 2018, an Israeli weapons company sold hundreds of assault rifles to the Philippines police, just months after the then president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, had said he was just like Hitler. If anybody on the left, if anybody in the Palestine movement said one word which was even had the slightest sympathy or was seen as having the slightest sympathy for Hitler, we know we would have the full weight of the media, the political parties, everybody coming down on that person and on the anti-Palestine movement. We've been through that movie with the false claims that people outside the Opera House chanted, "Gas the Jews." But when Duterte says he's just like Hitler, Israel sells him guns. Last year, the Israeli ambassador to Romania and one of the key leaders of the settler movement on the West Bank met with a man called George Simeon. George Simeon is a leader of a far-right party, and they wanted his support for the settler movement in the West Bank. That meeting was held with the permission and support of Israel's foreign minister. Yet previously, Simeon's party had been boycotted by Israel, partly due to the fact it makes anti-Semitic and Holocaust-denying statements and glorifies Romania's World War II fascist leaders. Israel today would rather consort with anti-Semites who support the Zionist project than with members of the left who stand up against racism. And Israel today very clearly is not a safe haven for Jews. Otherwise, tens of thousands would not have been evacuated from the north of the country in preparation for war with Hezbollah. If it's such a safe haven, people would not have died on October the 7th. Instead, it is revealed as a bulwark for imperialism. So Zionism, as I mentioned before, does have serious projects. It is burning political capital at a ferocious rate. It is losing the support when we chant in our thousands, in our millions, we are all Palestinians. That actually means something. tens, if not hundreds of millions of people have moved from the pro-Israel to the pro-Palestine side of the debate, and they're losing at least a significant proportion of Jewish support. But that does not mean, unfortunately, that the Zionist project is finished. The state itself, the economy, is still stable. Public debt, because of the current attacks on Gaza, will rise from 60% of GDP to 67% by 2025. The reality is that's quite manageable. The Israeli central bank still has more than $200 billion in reserve, and the military cyber complex of weapons manufacturers and IT developers and software developers is extremely lucrative for Israel. But I think even more importantly than that, Israel still stands on the two pillars of Zionism. I think there are two defining features of Zionism which, for the moment, are still intact. The first is a sense of defeatism amongst the Jewish population. And what I mean worldwide, and what I mean by that is a sense that anti-Semitism is inevitable, it's internal, it cannot be beaten, and in fact it's not even, most of the time, worth fighting. Theodor Herzl, who was regarded as the founder of the modern Zionist movement, was in Paris in the 1890s when the Dreyfus affair broke out. And Dreyfus was a Jewish officer in the French army who was fitted up as a scapegoat for some issue which I cannot remember. But it was clearly an anti-Semitic campaign to put the blame onto Dreyfus. And observing this, Herzl had this to say: "In Paris, I achieved a freer attitude towards anti-Semitism, which I now began to understand historically and to pardon. Above all, I recognised the emptiness and futility of trying to combat anti-Semitism." And you will find, if you buy the excellent new book, The Radical Jewish Tradition, which we have here and on the bookshelves, you will on the bookstalls, you will find example after example where the Zionists refused to take on anti-Semitism, argued that it was pointless, argued that all that Jews could do was to run away. Here's one example from the book that caught my eye. In 1939, the Nazis in America, the American Nazis, held a mass rally in Madison Square Gardens, huge arena in the heart of New York City, which was probably then 1/3 Jewish, but it was a threat clearly to everybody. 50,000 people responded to the call of a small Trotskyist party to surround Madison Square Gardens and to protest. But the Zionists said they had to send their apologies. And this was the left Zionists. "We have to send our apologies. Our Zionist policy is to take no part in politics outside Palestine." Now, we need to be clear that that defeatism was a minority current amongst world Jewry up until the horrors of the Holocaust. Most Jews felt they could deal with anti-Semitism either by migrating or assimilating, or most importantly, by fighting racism. And especially in Eastern Europe, which was the largest number of the Jewish community, in Poland and Austria, in the Russian Empire, the majority of Jews looked to socialism to free them from anti-Semitism. The Polish Jewish Trotskyist Isaac Deutscher wrote about Poland: "The most fanatical enemies of Zionism were precisely the workers, those who spoke Yiddish, those who considered themselves Jews. They were the most determined opponents of the idea of an emigration from Eastern Europe to Palestine." And in 1938 for the Warsaw City Council elections and 1939 for the Jewish Community Council elections, the Jewish socialists won the overwhelming bulk of the seats. The Zionists were marginalised. In July 1932, 6 months before Hitler takes power, the German Zionist organisation was told, "It should never be forgotten that we in Germany have to reckon not only with the indifference of extensive Jewish circles, but also with their hostility." And in 1933, as the Nazis come to power, 4 million Jews in the United States, 88,000 were Zionists. The Holocaust changed everything. David Ben-Gurion, the first Israeli Prime Minister, said, "What Zionist propaganda for years and years could not do, disaster has done overnight." And the Holocaust changed things in three ways. Firstly, it reinforced the idea that the Jews were unsafe and they had to run. After all, 6 million Jews were murdered in the Nazi gas chambers alongside many others, but 6 million Jews. Secondly, the Western countries had slammed their borders shut to Jews, and this includes Australia, slammed their borders shut to Jews before the Second World War, and they opened them just a tiny crack after the Second World War. There was open anti-Semitism in Australia against Jewish refugees after the Holocaust, when people knew what had happened in Auschwitz and Treblinka and so many other camps. And so for many Jews, if they wanted to flee the horrors of Europe, they actually only had one choice, which was Palestine. And I think the third reason was that when 6 million Jews went to the gas chambers, amongst them was the cream of the Jewish working class, the Jewish socialist working class. There was a physical liquidation of that idea that Jews could stand their ground in Poland, in Russia, and elsewhere in Eastern Europe and fight for a new society free of racism. That idea was physically eradicated by the Nazis. And although obviously the Zionists did not want that to happen, they benefited from that eradication. And while there is a growth of opposition to Zionism around the world, as I outlined in my earlier comments, the reality is the majority of Jewish communities are still wedded to that defeatist idea that there is no solution other than to look to Israel, to make Aliyah, which means to go to Israel, and so on and so forth. But there is a second reason why Israel is still stable and in the foreseeable future and safe, and that is the support of imperialism. And I would argue that it almost doesn't matter what Jews say about the Zionist project, so long as imperialism, in particular the United States, the European Union and its allies, including here in Australia, are wedded to support for Israel. And the Zionist project always fitted neatly, meshed with the project of imperialism. The imperialists in the end of the 19th century were still grabbing colonies around the world, riding roughshod over indigenous people on the basis that they were backward and uncivilized and so on and so forth. So when the Zionists said the Palestinians are backward and we are justified as Europeans in taking that land, it fitted with the prevailing views of European imperialism. But also, imperialism was interested not just in establishing colonies to plunder, but they were also establishing zones of influence to ensure that their control would go on. And therefore, when the Zionists came knocking, they didn't always get the answer they wanted, but they knew that they could ask imperialists for support because there would be a common interest. Between 1897, when Zionism was essentially officially founded, and his death in 1904, Theodor Herzl met the German Kaiser, the Ottoman Sultan. The Ottoman Empire is essentially the Turkish Empire, but it controlled much of the Middle East. The kings of Italy and Bulgaria, senior British ministers, the Pope, and in 1903, and this is particularly disgraceful, he met von Plehve, who was the Minister of the Interior in the Tsarist Russian Empire. Particularly disgraceful because the Russian Empire had been fomenting pogroms, race riots, deadly race riots against Jews since 1881 as an act of government policy. And in 1903, the year that Herzl met von Plehve, that was the year of one of the most notorious pogroms in the city of Kishinev. But Herzl went to each of these imperialists in turn and offered them two things. The first is that he would remove Jews from their land. The Jewish question would be solved. The Jewish socialists, the Jewish revolutionaries would be taken out of Russia or Germany or Turkey and put somewhere else. And that would solve a domestic problem for the imperialists. But then he offered something else. And this is what he said to the Ottoman Sultan. who actually owned Palestine at this point. If His Majesty were to give us Palestine, we would form there a part of the wall of defence of Europe in Asia, an outpost of civilization against barbarism. We would, as a neutral state, remain in contact with all Europe, which would have to guarantee our existence. So Herzl didn't actually get a deal before he died in 1904, but the Zionists got a deal from the British government in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, which said that Britain would support a Jewish homeland. Three things to note about that. Balfour was an anti-Semite through and through. As the Home Affairs Minister, he had actually introduced legislation to prevent poor Jews coming into Britain from Eastern Europe, and they were fleeing pogroms. Secondly, the only Jewish cabinet minister in 1917 voted against the Balfour Declaration because he recognised it would foment anti-Semitism. And thirdly, Britain had no interest in saving Jews from anti-Semitism. It was interested in establishing an outpost. And as Sir Ronald Storr, the first British civil governor of Jerusalem after the First World War, put it, enough Jews could return, if not to form a Jewish state, at least to prove that the enterprise would form a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism. Ulster, remember, are the 6 counties of Northern Ireland that Britain held on to when Ireland fought for its liberation from Britain, and by holding on to those counties, they guaranteed to split Ireland politically and to ensure a carnival of reaction north and south. Now, why were they worried about hostile Arabism? Imperialism has 2 significant strategic interests in the Middle East, and still does do today. The first is oil. Now, all of us in this room look forward to the day when oil stays in the ground as part of the transition to renewables and away from the use of fossil fuels. But oil, unfortunately, is still an absolutely integral part of world capitalism. The Middle East has 48.3% of world oil reserves. Western imperialism is not going to give up on this enormous treasure. It's not going to walk away. The other strategic importance is the Suez Canal. 12% of global trade, I'm talking today, 12% of global trade passes through the Suez Canal, 30% of all global shipping container traffic. So what was important to Britain in 1917, oil and the Suez Canal, is important to the US and Australia and Western imperialism in 2024. Then they were worried about Arabs fighting for their liberation from Western empires. Then they became worried that those newly independent Arab states would seize the oil and seize the Suez Canal. Nasser, the leader of Egypt, nationalised the Suez Canal, and then Israel, France and Britain launched a war to get the Suez Canal back. They failed on that occasion, which is good. But when the Iranian regime nationalised the oil, the CIA moved in to overthrow that regime. So the West was very, very worried about Arab nationalism, radical Arab nationalism. And when Israel defeated the Arab nationalist states in 1967 and 1973, the United States said, we're on a winner.
Sorry, 1973, they didn't defeat Egypt.
Okay, we can have discussion, comrade. When Israel won those wars, the United States says, we are on a winner, and the United States poured massive amounts of fund into Israel. They passed a $2.2 billion package, and that was a lot of money in 1973, and increased military aid 800%. And so Israel is the indispensable ally. Biden can play with words. He can say there are red lines about the invasion of Rafah, but Biden will support Israel. And only today it's been revealed another massive export of US weapons and bombs to Israel has gone ahead. Israel, the United States will forgive Israel's crimes because ultimately it relies on Israel in a way it cannot rely on Egypt or Jordan or Saudi Arabia. All of them are allies, but at the end of the day, they are vulnerable to revolution in a way that Israel is not. And I think it's just worth saying that this is where Australia fits in, and we can elaborate on this in the discussion. Australia is part of that part of that alliance. There are material interests in the Middle East. Alexander Downer, the former Foreign Secretary, in papers recently released, was talking about the significant interests for Australian capitalism in the Middle East in the run-up to the first Iraq war, not just in oil and minerals, but also in wheat. And there are shipping containers, I pretty much guarantee it, leaving Botany Bay this week, which will be passing through the Suez Canal a couple of weeks from now. But more importantly, Australia is tied in with the US imperialism, because US imperialism is the guarantor of Australian imperialism in the region. And on that basis, that Australia is locked into support for Israel. And this, not the Zionist lobby, not corruption, not moral weakness, this is the secret of Albanese flipping from pro-Palestine to an apologist from Israel. He is now the leader of Australian capitalism. Australian capitalism is tied to the US imperialist project. Imperialism needs Israel. Israel is not just the watchdog for Western interests, it is the bully, it is the standover merchant, it is the warmonger, and therefore the West comes in behind. So if we are going to finish imperialism, and I will finish on this point, yes, it is great that Israel is losing political capital and support amongst Jews. But if we are going to break Zionism, we need to see two things. Not just the continued resistance of the Palestinians, that's a given, but revolution amongst the Arab working class, the breaking of the control of imperialism right across the region. But secondly, we need a movement to smash imperialism, and we need to start right here, right now. The greatest gift of solidarity we can give to our Palestinian brothers and sisters is to break Australian imperialism, to build a movement here that can deliver real solidarity. From the river to the sea.